Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weeb Union, and in this one we start out in the Pokrovsk section of the front line where the Russians have managed to capture two villages. They've managed to capture the village of Mykolaiivka southeast of Novohrodivka, and in the north they've managed to capture Novotoretsk here northeast of Hrodivka. The Russians have here advanced in three separate directions. In the northern direction to capture Novotoretsk, allowing the Russians to now have a strong flank in the northern parts where they have control over all of the Ukrainian positions south of the river line, and this has allowed the Russians to have a strong flank to start sieging the town of Rodivka here in the north. The Ukrainians have fortified positions in the high grounds to the west of Rodivka, and the Russians have control over the fortified positions in the heights east of Rodivka, where there now is a battle between the heights and the fortified positions. The Russians are here advancing through the southern flank in the direction of the village of Shuravka, where they already have a foothold in the southern parts, following the capture of the fortified positions here in the eastern parts of Shuravka to advance in the direction of Krasny Yar and expand to positions the Russians have control of east of Novohrodivka. In the direction of Mykolaiivka, the Russians have advanced south of the railways and quickly capturing Mykolaiivka and pushing to gain control over a portion of the Ukrainian defensive line that goes through the south to the east of Selidove and to the south of the town. The Russians here would be looking to gain control over Hrodivka in the north, Novohrodivka in the center, and Selidove in the south, ahead of storming Pokrovsk. To do so, the Russians are moving along the fortified positions east of Selidove and starting to push towards Novohrodivka from the railways and Hrodivka from the northeast and southeast of the town, as well as with the foothold in the eastern parts of it. Despite the fact that with the Russian advances along the railways, they are now flanking the Ukrainian defenses near Selidove from the side, it will not be an easy task to get full control of it. This is because the Ukrainians have defensive positions along the defensive line in facing the northern direction along the first lines. We see one example here and another one right next to it to the south of Mykolaiivka. Further south as well, there's additional fortified positions, and even further south there are several fortified positions facing the northern direction. Therefore, the Russians do have a significant advantage by attacking from the side, but the Ukrainians are not completely unprepared. Taking a look at the topographic map, we see Pokrovsk here in the west, Hrodivka east of Pokrovsk, Novohrodivka further south, and Selidove even further south. So we see that the Russian positions in Mykolaiivka is right here next to Novohrodivka. Here, the Russian positions near Mykolaiivka are located at an elevation of 220 meters, where Novohrodivka is located at 214 meters, so there's a slight advantage, but generally it is the same height. If we take a look at Selidove, the northern, eastern, and southern parts of it are all located in the heights, while it is located in the low ground. The fortified positions from Mykolaiivka and down south to the southeast of Selidove are all located on the high ground, so are the fortified positions to the east of that line. From this, we see that the entirety of the high ground elevation areas are filled with fortified positions of the Ukrainians, which the Russians have to push through to gain control of it. However, gaining control of those will allow the Russians to be in a high ground advantage over the next Ukrainian line of defense, northwest of Krasnoorivka. If we take a look at the area, the entire line from Karelivka in the north and all the way down south to Kurahove in the south is all located at the low ground, and the Russians with their flanking maneuver from Mykolaiivka, if they push down south along the high ground towards Karelivka to the east and Kurahove to the south, the Russians will be able to have a very strong position here to the north of Vuhledar and in the general area west of Donetsk. The Ukrainian defensive positions all along the next line of defense and by Krasnoorivka would be completely cut off, and with a siege on Pokrovsk, the situation for the Ukrainians in the Donetsk region will become critical. If we take a look at the fortifications, we see that the Russians would be able to push down south along the fortified lines from Mykolaiivka, and connecting these fortified lines, they'll be at the rear of the Ukrainian next line of defense beyond Krasnoorivka. This means that there really is no reason for the Russians to push beyond their current positions in Krasnoorivka, where the Ukrainians are located in the residential area outside of the main parts of the city, in the low grounds where the Russians have an overview over their locations and can hit them from the heights. The Russians will be able to pressure the Ukrainians by redirecting their forces to Pokrovsk direction and attacking in a southern direction to flank the entirety of this section of the front line. At the same time, as the push continues in the direction of Pokrovsk, getting control over Novohrodivka by a direct assault, Hrodivka from a flanking to the south or from the flanking in the east and north, as well as a push towards Selidovo following the capture of fortified positions east of the village, will allow the Russians to attack Pokrovsk from 3 separate directions: from the highway to the south, from the railways in the center, and from Mirnorod in the east. At the same time, offensive operations could develop here northwest of Novoalexandrivka towards the highway between Konstantinivka and Pokrovsk. Rather than the Russians simply cutting off the road between Konstantinivka and Pokrovsk, gaining control over the city of Pokrovsk will allow the Russians to flank all of the Ukrainian fortified positions in the Donetsk region. Whether it is the Sloviansk-Kramatorsk line, the Russians can simply move along the fortified positions all the way to the rear of Kramatorsk and Sloviansk, as well as Turoshivka. They can at the same time flank the Ukrainian positions in Volodara in the south, or they could even move in a western direction in the direction of the city of Dnipro and Zaporizhia, flanking the Ukrainian positions in the south. Pokrovsk will be the position, if the Russians capture it, would completely change the nature of the fighting and the situation in the battlefield. Therefore, it is very important for the Ukrainians to defend the city, but instead of sending reinforcements there, they're sending them to Kursk. This is why the situation is very critical for the Ukrainians right now, with the recent Russian advances in the Pokrovsk direction. In the direction of New York, in the western flank of it, the Russians have captured the last forest patch, leaving no positions between the Russian lines and the Ukrainian positions in Oleksandropil and the village chain west of New York. We may see the battle of this village chain starting very soon, as the Russians will be pushing through the rest of New York. Moving on to the Kursk region, we see in this direction that the Ukrainians have started a second wave of their offensive in the Kursk region. The Ukrainians managed to gain full control over Sudzha and have since then started an offensive operation further northeast of Sudzha in the direction of Mikhailovka, which they've managed to capture, and Marshonovka. It seems that the Ukrainians will now be pushing here to the east of Sudzha to expand their zone of control and develop the offensive operations further. They may be looking to generally advance the front line to have a wider area under their control, which will allow them to have a stronger rear and slowly develop their supply lines so that they can continue pushing further into Russian territory. This points towards the Ukrainian operations in Koronevo and to the east simply being diversions. But at the same time, it is very likely that the Ukrainians are looking to gain full control over Koronevo, as recent reports suggest that the Ukrainians are attempting a flanking maneuver towards Koronevo, where they will be attacking the villages under Russian control to the east of Koronevo and flank it from the north. This is due to the Russian positions being along the river line, which gives the Russians that advantage when it comes to defense, that the Ukrainians would have to cross the river into a residential area to gain access to Koronevo, similar to the Chasiv Yar direction, which would be very difficult for the Ukrainians, especially with the use of the current tactics. Therefore, the Ukrainians will be looking to flank their positions by crossing the river in the eastern parts or along Kremenoa, the flank there, where the Russian positions and Ukrainian positions right now are split between the high grounds to the east of Koronevo and to the northeast of Koronevo, where the Russian positions are in the heights to the northeast and the Ukrainian positions are in the heights to the south. The Ukrainians have to pass through this wedge along the river line to pass through onto the high grounds of the Russian positions to flank Koronevo, which is what they're currently attempting. However, it is a very difficult operation as they would be attacking an uphill battle. At the same time, the Ukrainians are also attacking from the south to expand the front line here. This could lead to a Ukrainian advance towards the western flank of Koronevo, but again, they would face the similar issue. Therefore, it is likely that the Ukrainians will focus entirely on this northeastern parts, where they will then attempt to flank Koronevo. I previously mentioned that the town of Koronevo would determine the battle over Kursk, and this is exactly because it is a well-defended town, and beyond it, there is several areas of high ground positions that would be open for Ukrainians to advance through, leading to the Ukrainians having control over the heights, over the roads between Lvov in the east to Rilsk in the west. The Ukrainians having control over the heights here south of the road would allow them to hit that supply line and limit the Russian supplies towards Rilsk, which would allow the Ukrainians to expand the front line and attack in the western parts of the Kursk region, opening up another front due to the limited supply of the Russians in Rilsk direction. Therefore, the Russians are here looking to stabilize the front south of Lvov and prevent the Ukrainians from hitting the town or Rilsk, and to then deploy their forces to the south of these towns towards the fields and villages south of them to prevent a Ukrainian control over the heights, and this is why Korenevo plays such an important role. At the same time, in the direction of Sudzha, there is no major residential areas or military significant targets in the east. This points towards the Ukrainians simply wanting to expand their zone of control and territories with no specific targets. These developments point towards the Ukrainian objective to be simply to gain as much control over Russian territory as possible, but at the same time the Russians are slowly stabilizing the front, where they have recently recaptured the village of Krupets and pushed the Ukrainians back to Spelnoe, which has limited the Ukrainian positions in the south. The Russians, the longer time goes, the more they're able to build fortified positions and send additional forces to the front, where they'll be able to stabilize it and then slowly turn the Ukrainian foothold in the Kursk region into a fire pocket where they'll rain down FAB bombs and additional long-range weaponry and air force on the Ukrainian positions, which would be devastating for them. Over the past few days, multiple convoys of Ukrainian vehicles, armored personnel carriers, and infantry fighting vehicles have been hit. There is also this video of a Ukrainian Challenger 2 tank, which was sent to the Kursk region, which is a part of the 82nd Air Assault Brigade, which was destroyed in the Kursk region, and it blew up with an ammo rack. So we see that the Ukrainians are sending the best units to the Kursk region to launch this assault, yet we are seeing that the Russians are slowly stabilizing the front and increasing their firepower. If the Russians are able to stabilize the front, the Ukrainians would be having a very, very difficult time in the Kursk region, and would be better for them to simply withdraw and save their firepower instead of using it up in this offensive, which in the end really turns out to be senseless after all. This offensive has so far been a victory for Ukraine. They were able to launch a successful offensive, they were able to capture hundreds of square kilometers, and they were able to capture Russian soldiers for exchange of prisoners of war, which the Russians have had a significant amount more of POWs than Ukrainians have had. But with the recent capture of troops, the Ukrainians would be able to restart the exchange of large amounts of soldiers in the war. However, the Ukrainians seem determined to double down in their Kursk offensive with the recent push, which points towards the Ukrainians not taking their win and then going away with it, celebrating it. Instead, they'll be taking their win and then double down, which gives the risk of it. It's pretty much like a double or nothing, where if the Ukrainians just continue, they'll lose more than they could gain from this offensive, and they'll turn a successful offensive into a failure of an offensive. So the Ukrainians really need to look at the situation right now and determine, is it worth it to continue, or should we turn back and say thank you for today? We'll see you next time. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon for additional content. Thank you for watching, and have a great day.